logical condition. Okay, so this has been a very common theme in anthropology and psychology. And obviously, I've already mentioned, there is an understanding in many traditions of the difference between negative spirit possession and positive spirit possession. Okay, but this isn't what anthropologists and psychologists are trying to say. They're not saying there is, negative possession and positive possession. They're really saying that there is only dissociative identity disorder. Okay. But obviously we can ask this question, can all possession really be explained in terms of pathology? There are some similarities, phenomenological similarities, for instance, between dissociative identity and spirit possession. Obviously, in both, there's a loss of consciousness and different personalities are involved, all those kind of things. But are they identical? And there is, I don't know if I've got slides on it here. No, I haven't. I'll just mention it. There is some interesting research, neuroimaging research, it's documented, written about in the book, if you are interested, that shows that there are actually, very different kinds of neurological state of consciousness to when someone is in, dissociative identity disorder or some kind of a psychogenic fugue or something like that. There's actually different kinds of brain activity. So in that sense, there are physical differences between mediumship and illnesses. So it can't be a blanket explanation again. It can't be a catch-all explanation for all mediumship because there is evidence that points in the opposite direction. There's also interesting evidence to suggest that people who are mediums are actually more psychologically healthy than a sample of normal people from the general population based on all sorts of different kinds of psychological measures. Anyway, here's a kind of classic example of this attempt to explain things like spirit possession and mediumship in terms of pathology. This is an early example from Herbert Spencer, one of the founders of sociology. He says, during insensibilities of all kinds, the soul wanders and on returning causes the body to resume its activity. If the soul can thus not only go out of the body, but can go into it again, then may not the body be entered by some other soul? The savage thinks it may. People ascribe epilepsy to demoniac possession. Of Asiatic races may be instanced the Kalmucks. By these nomads, epileptics are regarded as persons into bad spirits have entered. Okay, so very early on then, epilepsy, spirit possession or shamanism. And then the extent to which these kind of excellent, these really reductive materialist kind of explanations will go is really amazing. In the 1980s, there was sort of a movement in thinking about possession in terms of diet. And there was a paper that was published by Keogh and just subsisting on diets pouring calcium, magnesium, niacin, tryptophan, thiamine, and vitamin D, and those practicing spirit possession. Conversely, populations reported as having probably adequate intakes of these nutrients generally lack culturally sanctioned spirit possession. This argument was quite quickly kind of shot down by people like Erica Bourguignon, anthropologists who had been studying spirit possession for a long time, because it ignored all sorts of different kinds of for example, just one example, the cultural embeddedness of these practices. Illnesses have their place within society and are recognized, but these practices are built into, broader social structures. It's not often that, illnesses are built on like that, is it? So it's very interesting that they would try to reduce it down literally to, deficiency of nutrients as the cause of spirit possession. Very, very, very reductive. And another strand of reductive approaches has been from the psychological angle. And we can broadly split these psychological approaches to mediumship into two categories. There's the sort of psychopathological end of approaches, Jungian approaches, and then there are cognitive approaches as well, which have become very, very popular. Certainly 10 years ago anyway, the cognitive paradigm in anthropology was kind of becoming ascendant. Okay, so in psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theories of spirit possession, they take a kind of Freudian kind of angle and suggest that, you know, it is essentially a symptom that is the result of past traumatic and distressful experiences that have been, you know, repressed and all these kinds of things in the same way that Freud talked about, but then are given expression in these particular culturally sanctioned ways. So in a way, it's like a merger of Freudian psychodynamic and a social functional kind of approach. So one of the most famous psychoanalytic studies of spirit possession is by Gananatha Baisakya, called Medusa's Hair, about spirit possession in India. And he adopted this kind of approach. So he saw possession as a cultural symptom, along with other physical expressions. So matted hair of priestesses and things were all seen as physical representations or symbolization of inner repressed trauma. Okay, but obviously, again, it's not a catch-all explanation, even though it's often presented as if it is. And the same goes for Emma Cohen's recent, or more recent anyway, cognitive approach. She basically suggests that spirit possession is the result of faulty cognitive processes, or when we have a sort of a category error. So she talks about, when she's talking about pathogenic possession, for example, it's to do with a category error in the way that we usually process information about illness. Way of thinking, I think, and if you are interested in my critiques of it, you can have a look in the book as well. But here's how she defines it. Pathogenic possession concepts result from the operation of cognitive tools that deal with the representation of contamination, both positive and negative. The presence of the spirit entity is typically, but not always, manifested in the form of illness. Executive possession concepts mobilize cognitive tools that deal with the world of intentional agents. The spirit entity is typically represented as taking over the host's executive control or replacing the host's mind or intentional agency, thus assuming control of bodily behaviors. So really she's saying that it's all to do with the way that our brains make sense of the world. And sometimes if we have these kind of errors or cross wires, or however you want to think about it, that we believe in, you know, in the existence of invisible beings and things like that, different reasons, which we don't have time to go into right now. But if you want to, you can have a look in the book. And people have used these kinds of lines of reason to do all sorts of things, like, for example, explaining religion away in terms of cognitive processes, which doesn't necessarily work. Okay. And then dissociative identity disorder. Obviously, there are very clear similarities between possession, trance, dissociative identity. So this is a description of dissociative identity disorder. Okay, it's a condition in which a person may have at least two separate ego states or alters, different modes of being and feeling and acting that exist independently of each other and that come forth and are in control at different times. And that sounds a lot like mediumship. There are typically 2 to 4 alters at the time a diagnosis is made, but over the course of treatment, several more often emerge. Gaps in memory are also common, and this is what Eliade was talking about with mediumship, the lack of recall of the trance, and are produced because at least one alter has no contact with the others. The existence of different alters must also be chronic, long-lasting, and be a temporary change resulting from the ingestion of a drug, for example. Okay, so this is kind of a catch-all definition of dissociative identity disorder. And it does, you know, on the face value of it, have many similarities with mediumship and possession. But anthropologist Morton Klass, a great book called Mind Over Mind, Anthropology and Psychology of Spirit Possession, and he points us in a slightly different direction. Possession is embedded within historical and cultural contexts, which suggests that it's much more than something abnormal. When someone suffers from dissociative identity disorder, it's irrational and it makes no sense. It's in contravention to the norms and values of society, which is why it's, whereas spirit possession, although it has many of the same hallmarks as a dissociative identity, is culturally embedded. It's actually, in Morton Klass's world, patterned. So he suggests, Morton Klass instead suggests that we can have dissociative identity disorder as one thing, and then we can have patterned dissociative identity on the other. Okay, so mediumship and possession would be patterned because they have a role and a function for them. That's different to, you know, illnesses. So I think this is a really interesting line of thinking. So here are some of the main problems then with the dominant models. So the social and cultural embeddedness of possession experiences, like I was just saying, is really important. The fact that they have a place and a role and a function within society. They're not spontaneous. They are usually induced deliberately for particular reasons. Okay? And there is social and cultural meaning behind that and around it, and symbols that adorn it, and all of these kind of things, which make, you know, within its own cultural context, clearly demarcated from illnesses. Another interesting angle, I didn't talk about this, but John Boker gives a good explanation of a funeral. So you could have a functionalist descript buried in order to, you know, dispose of it and prevent disease and all of these kinds of things. But to look at it in that way totally ignores the understanding of the people who are participating in the funeral, for whom the funeral might have many, many other kinds of functions, like spiritual functions, or that, you know, it's doing something for the dead and all of these kind of things. So this is the limitation of functionalism, is that it really ignores that side of things. And then if we take the phenomenology seriously, you know, then it opens up, like as I keep saying, it opens up into new territories that these dominant approaches really haven't been able to accommodate. So, you know, what does the experience mean to the experiencer, rather than what function does this ritual perform in the society that it's taking place in? So, you know, we can shift our focus on much deeper on the phenomenology. And we can also say, well, what are the areas of parapsychology? We don't have enough time to go into, but there is a lot of evidence that suggests that some people do have extraordinary capabilities under certain circumstances. All of that is ignored in all of the dominant approaches and explanations in anthropology. Okay, so there's lots of interesting potential fruit for discussion between anthropology and parapsychology. So I'll just start to, what time is it? Start to wrap up now. So, you know, there are different ways that we can approach mediumship that don't necessarily fall into those same reductionist traps. And like I suggested before, one of those ways is to focus on the processes that are involved. So, for example, how the body is used. And I won't read through all of this now, but there are plenty of cross-cultural examples where anthropologists have described the use of the body in different spirit possession practices, which seem to suggest an important role for the body in mediumship. And this is a great example, is used in very particular ways to express the presence of specific spirits. So these hand gestures would be representative of one particular spirit, for example. So that was one thing that I focused in on. And then another thing that I became very interested in was the role of performance and of different ways of understanding performance, because it was clear that mediumship innovations were performances. You know, they are people doing things, other people are observing them. But there is a tendency, you know, in the West to think of a performance as a lie or as a trick or as an illusion or something like that. And I'd stumbled across this great work of Rich Schechner. He says, when in Western theatre we speak of an actor portraying a role, using metaphor from painting where the artist studies a subject and produces an image of that subject, we slide away from the main fact of performance, that the portrayal is a transformation of the performer's body or mind. The canvas or material is the performer. He talked about the efficacy entertainment braid, or we could think of it as a spectrum or a continuum. And some performances are pure terms of ritual and things are for the effects that they bring about. And then there you can have things that are at various different stages along that continuum as well. And seances, I would suggest, are one of these things that exist somewhere in the between on this efficacy entertainment braid. They are for entertainment, and that's one of their social functions that they perform for people. They, you know, people enjoy going out to these social events, and yet at the same time, there is an understanding that these performances are also efficacious in some way, that they actually bring about a change. And then if we look in the cross-cultural context, you know, it's fine to say that, you know, the shaman in the Amazon jungle, for instance, transforms into a jaguar spirit during his shamanic ceremony, because that is in that particular context, and you know, it's not in the Western context. So what if we say that in the context of a trance, you know, a spiritualist trance seance, where mediums physical body into a spirit body? And so it works in one context, but it kind of gets shrugged or frowned upon in another context, which is something I find very interesting. So I thought, you know, I would focus in on this issue and think about the way that performance and trickery and all of these kinds of things might actually be part of the process of inducing, you know, extraordinary experiences in who are witness to them. Okay. So what I'm saying here then is that the seance really, you know, if we look at all of these different explanations, we can say that they are picking out on different factors that are involved in these kinds of performances, but none of them in their, you know, individually is able to kind of accommodate the real complexity of mediumship in its totality. So what we need is some kind of a framework that can accommodate all of these different multiple perspectives, multiple processes in any given ethnographic situation. And this is what I have been calling for the past few years now, ontological flooding. The idea for ontological flooding, which we'll see in a minute, comes from bracketing in phenomenology. Well, I don't want to run out of time, see if I can explain it. So when we talk about ontology, we're talking about being or existence, the things that exist, what things exist, what things don't exist, and all that kind of stuff. So ontology is a discussion about existence. But we can also talk about an ontology. And an ontology is a model of all that exists. So it's like a model of the world, a model of all the things that exist within the world. Okay? So this is what we mean when we're talking about ontology. But in anthropology, we're also aware that there are many ontologies, and that actually, you know, each culture, each worldview essentially has its own ontological framework, and they don't necessarily always match up with each other. So for some people, the cosmos is a living system, a living thing. Other ontology, the cosmos is just matter, all sorts of different bits of matter colliding with each other. Okay, so there are many different ontologies. But in the West, in science, the dominant ontology is really a form of materialism. But again, materialism is just one amongst many different kinds of ontologies. And the influence of materialism, Western materialism, is very apparent when it comes to talking about things like we have been talking about, extraordinary experiences and all these kind of things, which really challenge these assumptions. So here's Edith Turner. She says, she points this out. She says, again and again, anthropologists witness spirit rituals, and again, some indigenous exegete tries to explain that the spirits are present, and furthermore, that rituals are the central events of their society. And the anthropologist proceeds to interpret them differently. There seems to be a kind of force field between the anthropologist and her or his subject matter, making it impossible for her or him to come close to it, a kind of religious frigidity. We anthropologists need training to see what the natives see. So this, our the ontology that we bring to us in our research influences the way that we look at the world. So we need to be able to kind of escape from our own models of the world. In phenomenology, the way that they do this is called epoche, or bracketing, more commonly called bracketing. And the idea is that you put brackets around questions to do with what exists when you do your research. So, I would go into the field and I would experience mediumship like I did and write it up without thinking about whether spirits are real or not. I would put that question out of my mind and say, actually, as an anthropologist, I can't actually answer that question. All I can do is describe my experience of a particular social situation that I'm in. Okay, so put another way, the phenomenologist suspends inquiry into the hidden determinants of action in order to describe the implications, intentions, and effects of what people say, do, and hold to be true. So you get rid of wondering about whether things are real or not, what the ontology is, and just focus on social facts, essentially beliefs. And became the approach. This is E. Evans Pritchard, and he said in a book called Primitive Religion, which is like a textbook for anthropologists for a long time, said, as I understand the matter, there's no possibility of knowing whether the spiritual beings of primitive religions or of any others have any existence or not. And since that's the case, the anthropologist cannot take the question into consideration. So this became the dominant view. The anthropologist can't consider the issue of reality. All we can do is talk about social facts, which reduces really experience to culture and belief. And this leads us into a kind of relativism, which is a kind of security blanket in a lot of ways for the dominant ontology. Because we can say that, materialism isn't challenged by these other ontologies because they are just systems of belief. But this is really problematic. And Jeremy Northcott, a sociologist, points this out. He says that there is a fundamental bias in bracketing approaches that arises from the fact that an analyst taking such an approach must inevitably make a decision about where to place the brackets, and hence define some aspects of supernormal belief or activity as being social in nature, and the remainder is not, which itself is an ontological claim. So he's saying that putting brackets up around these questions is actually problematic, because you're saying that, well, according to my perspective, this stuff I can study and that stuff I can't. And actually, most of the time, that stuff that you can't study, you probably actually could study it, as I did. Okay, so this is the process of exclusion, then, bracketing, really. It's saying we don't want to deal with that stuff, we push it to the side. So I take inspiration from Charles Fort, and he offers us this philosophy that he calls Intermediatism. And this is a very different way of looking at the world, completely different ontology, that is really equally as valid as any other. And from this view, nothing is real, nothing is unreal, and all phenomena are approximations in one way between realness and unrealness. So what he's saying is that instead of thinking of things in terms of discrete categories, like either or categories, we can think about things in terms of spectrums, or in terms of continuums and things like that. So nothing is ever 100% real. And that also means that things are never 100% unreal either. And he proposed that from this idea would come a new position of inclusivity, of bringing in ideas into science rather than excluding ideas and pushing them out. So Jeffrey Kreikel says, with this term, thought meant to refer to a philosophical position that involves the refusal of all easy polarizing answers to the problems of the paranormal, and the related insistence that whatever such phenomena are or are not, they cannot be mapped onto the cognitive grid of the pair's mental material, real, unreal, subjective, objective, and so on. Okay, so I take inspiration from Charles Fort in a lot of different ways. And I'll just wrap up now. So my solution then, to try and encourage this new paradigm really of inclusivity that Charles Fort was talking about, is to break down all of these, any ideas of brackets or barriers and things, and actually just let the damn facts flow. Let the information, the data, and the ideas flow. And this is how I described it back in 2015. Rather than bracketing out questions of ontology for fear that they might lead to truths, damned facts in Fort's terminology that cannot fit into the established order of Western academia's dominant ontology, I suggest that we essentially open the floodgates of ontological possibilities. This places all ontologies on an equal footing, so that while ontological bracketing protects and reinforces the mainstream consensus reality, what we might call ontological flooding destabilizes it and opens it up to questioning, exploration, and expansion. So what I'm saying is, we can take into consideration all of this functionalist stuff, the psychological, psychodynamic processes, cognitive processes, and all of those kind of things. We can take it all into consideration, but we can't take any single one of those as a complete description or a complete explanation. And actually the truth lies somewhere in the mix of all of these different frameworks. Okay, so there are many different processes that are going on. So my approach emphasizes multiple contributing processes involved in mediumship, which I've already mentioned: performance in the body, psychological processes, sociological, cultural, physiological, as well as, taking parapsychology into consideration, the role of psi, spirits, and all the other things that might be going on in the world that we might not even have any comprehension of at the moment. So instead of trying to say that we can explain this in terms of very simple theories, what I'm saying is that we should actually be trying to develop really complex theories, complex approaches that can incorporate many different interactive processes. And really, we could think about this as a sort of an ecological model that emphasizes interconnectivity, complexity, and also emergent phenomena, so that you can have things that are more than the sum of their parts. So for example, in a seance that is essentially a group of people interacting with each other in a dark room with some music on, you can have from that complexity emerging, for instance, complex spirit personalities that you can communicate with. Okay, so what ultimately I'm saying is that spirits are manifested and emerge when the conditions are right in the seance and amongst all of these different kinds of processes. So when we have this complexity forming, then we may have sort of like emergent phenomena. Okay, so my conclusions are that mediumship is a complex phenomenon with multiple contributing factors, and we could say that really it's more than the sum of its parts. The problems that are facing the dominant models of spirit mediumship include explaining the social and cultural embeddedness of the phenomena, so the fact that they're culturally significant, differentiating pathological and non-pathological states, and addressing apparent evidence from parapsychology and all that kind of stuff. Performance is not just about entertainment as in the Western tradition, but can actually be, and is understood in many other traditions around the world, as a genuine metaphysical transformation of the body. So what if it is also doing that in Western mediumship contexts? So really no single explanatory framework is sufficient in itself. Understand it because it's an experience that all of these different processes come together. And ultimately, ontological flooding, what I've just been describing, might provide a framework. I'm not saying it's perfect or that it's a solution or anything like that, but it might help in some ways to accommodate multiple simultaneous contributing factors in any situation. And that'll do. Thank you very much.